There are moments in pop culture that feel like lightning in a bottle, a perfect storm of time, place, and personality that creates something incandescent, something unforgettable. For a few glittering years in the early 1970s, that lightning was captured on stage every time a band called Sweet performed. And at the very heart of that storm, bathed in the glow of the spotlights, was a man with a voice of gold and the face of an angel, Brian Connolly. Imagine it. It's 1973. You're huddled around a television set watching Top of the Pops. The world outside might be a dreary landscape of strikes and economic gloom, but on that screen, a revolution is happening. And there he is. Long, flowing, golden hair framing a face that could launch 1,000 fanzines. He's clad in satin and silk, maybe a flash of glitter on his cheekbones. He grips the microphone, a confident smirk playing on his lips, and then he opens his mouth. The sound that emerges is pure crystalline power, a soaring tenor that can handle a sweet pop melody one moment and then unleash a blistering, street-fighting rock and roll scream the next. For millions of teenagers, this wasn't just music, it was an escape. And Brian Connolly was their charismatic, swaggering guide. But every lightning strike eventually fades, leaving only the rumbling echo of thunder. Behind the dazzling facade of the glam rock icon, a very different story was unfolding. It was a story of profound insecurity, of a desperate search for identity, of a brutal act of violence that stole a piece of his gift forever. It's a story of how the very thing that made him a star, that incredible one-in-a-million voice, became the source of his deepest pain. This is more than just another rock and roll tragedy. This is the heartbreaking saga of Brian Connolly, the lost voice of a generation. To truly understand the meteoric rise and devastating fall of Brian Connolly, we have to transport ourselves back to the Britain that forged him. The post-war era, into which Brian was born in 1945, was a country slowly, painfully rebuilding itself from the rubble. The 1950s and 60s, while remembered for the cultural explosion of the swinging 60s, were still defined by a lingering austerity for many working-class families. Life was often painted in shades of gray. Then came the 1970s, an era of profound social and economic turbulence. The optimism of the 60s curdled into a decade of industrial disputes, power cuts, and a pervasive sense of national decline. It was against this drab, discontented backdrop that a new cultural force erupted in a supernova of sound and color, glam rock. Glam was a glorious two-fingered salute to the mundane. It was a movement that rejected the gritty realism of the blues rock boom and the intellectual navel-gazing of progressive rock. It was loud, it was peacock proud, and it was unapologetically, fantastically artificial. Artists like Mark Bolan of T-Rex emerged as elfin-faced rock gods, while Slade brought a boisterous, working-class boot stomp to the party. And then there was David Bowie, the ultimate chameleon, whose Ziggy Stardust persona blurred the lines of gender and alien otherness, creating a new mythology for the disaffected youth. Fashion was as important as the music. Platform boots, glitter, satin jumpsuits, and androgynous makeup became the uniform of this new rebellion. It was pure, unadulterated escapism, and Britain was desperate for it. This was the stage being set for a band like Sweet, and a frontman born to shine on it. Brian's own story, however, began far from the glitter of the London stage, rooted in a fundamental sense of loss and searching. He was born Brian Francis Connolly on October 5, 1945, in Govan Hill, Glasgow. His mother, Frances Connolly, was a young waitress, unable to care for him. In a decision that would echo throughout his entire life, she left her infant son in a Glasgow hospital. This act of abandonment created a void in Brian's life, a question mark at the very core of his identity that he would spend decades trying to answer. At the age of 2, he was fostered by Jim and Helen McManus, a warm, loving couple from the nearby town of Blantyre. They gave him a stable, happy home and raised him as their own. It was here, in this tight-knit, working-class community, that Brian discovered his voice. He was a natural showman from a young age, his powerful, melodic singing voice turning heads in local pubs and social clubs. His early forays into music were with bands like the Waverly, cutting his teeth on the tough, demanding circuit of the time, playing covers of the day's hits. But Blantyre felt small, and Brian's dreams were anything but. The magnetic pull of London, the epicenter of the music world, was too strong to resist. In the mid-1960s, with little more than his voice and his ambition, he made the journey south. London was a whirlwind of music and opportunity. It was here that Brian's path fatefully intersected with that of a talented young drummer named Mick Tucker. They bonded instantly over a shared love for the thunderous beats of bands like The Who and a burning desire to make it big. They formed a band, a soul-influenced outfit called Wainwright's Gentlemen. The lineup was fluid, but the ambition was constant. After a few crucial changes, the classic quartet was forged. The quiet, witty bassist Steve Priest joined, bringing a mischievous energy and impeccable vocal harmonies. And finally, the technically gifted and musically astute guitarist Andy Scott completed the puzzle. They renamed themselves The Sweet, and the chemistry was undeniable. In these early days, they were a raw, hungry pop-rock band. They honed their craft in small clubs and ballrooms, developing a tight, energetic live show. They were writing their own material, a heavier, more rock-oriented sound that hinted at the direction they truly wanted to go. But a band can have all the talent in the world and still go nowhere without a break. That break came in the form of a partnership that would be both their greatest blessing and their most profound curse. Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman were the undisputed kings of the British pop charts. Known as Chinichap, they were a hit-making factory, possessing an uncanny ability to craft irresistibly catchy 3-minute pop songs that were precision-engineered for radio play. When they discovered Sweet, they saw the perfect vehicle for their confections. A band with a charismatic, golden-haired frontman and a powerhouse musical engine. The deal was struck, and Sweet's fortunes transformed overnight. The hits began to pour out with relentless speed. Funny Funny, Coco, Papa Joe, Little Willie, Wigwam Bam. These songs were pure bubblegum pop, infectious and upbeat, and they sent Sweet rocketing to the top of the charts. They became staples on top of the pops, their flamboyant, glam-inspired image captivating a generation. Brian, with his undeniable star quality and soaring vocals, was the heartthrob, the face of the band, his posters adorning millions of teenage bedroom walls. But behind the scenes, a deep-seated frustration was brewing. The band, especially Brian and Andy, felt creatively stifled. They were serious musicians who revered bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. Yet here they were, dressed in satin and glitter, singing what they considered to be lightweight, disposable pop songs. The conflict came to a head. The band wanted to write their own music to be taken seriously as a hard rock act. This led to a fascinating and schizophrenic compromise. Chinichap would continue to write the A-sides, the guaranteed chart toppers, but the band would be allowed to write and record the B-sides themselves. This created a bizarre dichotomy in their output. A fan who bought a single for a catchy tune like Little Willie would flip it over and be hit with a blast of heavy guitar-driven rock like Man from Mecca. Their albums like Sweet Fanny Adams and Desolation Boulevard further showcase this heavier side, filled with the band's own powerful compositions. This internal tug-of-war, however, produced some of their most iconic and enduring work. It was in this crucible of conflict that they forged a unique sound, a perfect fusion of pop hooks and hard rock muscle. Songs like Blockbuster, Hellraiser, Teenage Rampage, and the immortal The Ballroom Blitz were the result. They were anthems of youthful rebellion, and Brian's voice was the battle cry, effortlessly bridging the gap between pop melody and raw rock power. This golden era, however, was also when the darkness began to creep in. The rock and roll lifestyle was not a myth. It was a relentless cycle of touring, recording, and promotional duties, all fueled by a river of alcohol. The pressure to maintain the image of the carefree, party-loving rock star was immense. Brian, who underneath the confident stage persona was described by those who knew him as sensitive, shy, and deeply insecure, found a dangerous comfort in drinking. It started as a social lubricant, a way to ease the anxiety and inhabit the larger-than-life character he played on stage. But slowly, insidiously, it began to take control. Then came the incident that changed everything. In early 1974, at the absolute zenith of their fame, Brian was viciously assaulted outside a nightclub in Staines. The exact details of the attack remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting reports. Some say it was a random mugging, others a targeted attack, and some whispered it was a drunken brawl that got out of hand. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. Brian was kicked repeatedly in the throat. The band's management downplayed the severity of the injury, but the damage was profound and permanent. Brian was left unable to sing for a significant period. When he finally returned to the studio to record vocals for the Sweet Fanny Adams album, the change was audible. The astonishingly high-pitched, almost feminine screams that had been a signature part of his vocal repertoire were gone. He could no longer reach those stratospheric notes that had defined songs like Blockbuster. His voice was still powerful, still one of the best in the business, but a crucial part of his instrument had been stolen from him. The psychological toll was even greater than the physical one. His voice was his identity, his confidence, his superpower. Now, it was flawed. This brutal, senseless act of violence seems to have been a point of no return for Brian. It deepened his insecurities and undoubtedly accelerated his descent into alcoholism. He was now drinking not just to cope with the pressures of fame, but to numb the pain of a profound and intimate loss. Despite this devastating setback, Sweet's star continued to rise, particularly in North America. They finally achieved their long-held dream of breaking the American market with the Desolation Boulevard album. A key part of this success was Fox on the Run, a song written entirely by the band. It was a massive international hit, a moment of ultimate vindication for their creative talents. This should have been their crowning glory. But as the band was reaching its artistic peak, their frontman was spiraling into a personal abyss. Brian's drinking was no longer a backstage secret. It was becoming a public liability. His live performances grew increasingly erratic. On a good night, he was still the consummate showman, captivating the audience with his charm and powerful voice. But on a bad night, he was a tragic spectacle. He would forget lyrics, slur his words, and stumble around the stage. The rest of the band, particularly Andy Scott, had to cover for him, singing his parts, trying to hold the show together. The other members, Andy, Steve, and Mick, were caught in an impossible situation. They were a brotherhood, forged in the crucible of the road. They loved Brian. They tried to intervene, pleading with him to get help. But Brian was in the grips of a powerful addiction, and he either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the severity of his problem. The frustration and resentment within the band grew to a breaking point. Their dream was turning into a nightmare, held hostage by the demons of their lead singer. The final heartbreaking chapter of Brian's time with Sweet was written in 1979 during the recording of the album Cut Above the Rest. Brian's voice, ravaged by years of alcohol abuse, was a shadow of its former self. He struggled to hold a tune in the studio, his performances so weak that the other members were forced to step in and sing lead vocals on a number of tracks. For a man whose entire identity was tied to his voice, this was the ultimate humiliation. The band was faced with an agonizing choice: watch the band they had built from nothing disintegrate completely, or make the decision they had been dreading for years. With heavy hearts, they asked Brian to leave Sweet. It wasn't a malicious act, but one of desperation and self-preservation. For Brian, it was the end of his world. He had lost his band, his creative family, and the platform for his art. The years that followed Brian's departure were a long, slow, and public decline. He attempted to launch a solo career, releasing a few singles, but the magic was gone. The music industry, always chasing the next big thing, had moved on. He formed his own version of the band, initially called Brian Connolly Sweet, and later the New Sweet, and began the grueling, often thankless, life of a heritage act. He toured the club and festival circuit across Europe, playing the classic Sweet hits to nostalgic crowds. But he was a ghost of his former self. His health, battered by decades of relentless alcoholism, was in a catastrophic state. He suffered a series of major heart attacks in the mid-'80s, which left him temporarily paralyzed down one side of his body. The attacks and subsequent medical issues further degraded his nervous system and his voice. Yet, he pushed on, driven by a need to perform, or perhaps simply a need to pay the bills. In the midst of this professional struggle, Brian continued his lifelong search for personal connection. He had married and divorced, fathering children with whom he had complex relationships. In a poignant, rarely discussed part of his life, he finally made contact with his birth family. He discovered he had a living brother, and he met members of the Connolly family. But this reunion, which he had hoped would bring a sense of closure and belonging, was reportedly fraught with its own set of complications. It didn't provide the simple healing answer he had spent a lifetime searching for. The controversy over the band's name only added to the tragedy. For years, there were two versions of Sweet on the Road: Andy Scott's official lineup and Brian's incarnation. This led to legal disputes and confusion among fans, a sad postscript to the story of a once unified brotherhood. It wasn't a debate with two equal sides. It was the story of a fractured legacy, with Brian, the original voice, increasingly on the losing end. Those who encountered him in these later years often spoke of a man who was gentle, friendly, and surprisingly humble, but who was enveloped in a profound aura of sadness. He was acutely aware of what he had lost. One striking anecdote tells of him breaking down in tears during an interview when asked about his departure from the band. The pain still raw and palpable after more than a decade. He was haunted by the past, by the ghost of the golden-haired rock god he could no longer be. Despite his failing health, he possessed a remarkable, almost defiant will to continue. In the 1990s, he seemed to find a measure of peace. He had a stable partner, and he continued to perform, even when it was physically agonizing. The music was his last remaining lifeline, the only thread connecting him to the man he once was. On February 9th, 1997, Brian Connolly's long and painful struggle finally came to an end. After being admitted to the hospital, he suffered another heart attack and passed away from a combination of liver failure and cardiac arrest. He was only 51 years old. His death wasn't a major news event. It was a quiet, somber end for a man whose voice had once been one of the loudest sounds in rock and roll. So what is the lasting significance of Brian Connolly's story? Musically, his legacy is secure. Sweet's unique blend of pop hooks and hard rock power directly influenced a legion of bands that followed. From the stadium rock of Def Leppard to the glam metal of Mötley Crüe and Poison, you can hear Sweet's DNA in their vocal harmonies, their catchy choruses, and their guitar-heavy sound. Brian's versatile, powerful vocals set a benchmark for rock frontmen. He was, without question, one of the great unsung voices of his generation. But his human story holds a deeper, more resonant meaning. It serves as one of the most powerful and tragic cautionary tales in music history. It's a heartbreaking illustration of the human cost of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll mythos. His life exposes the brutal pressures of fame, the way it can magnify personal insecurities, and provide the means for self-destruction. His journey from a fostered child searching for identity to a global superstar, and then to a broken man haunted by his own past, is a narrative of staggering emotional weight. It reminds us that behind every iconic image, there is a fragile human being, susceptible to the same pain and frailties as the rest of us. In the end, perhaps the most fitting way to remember Brian Connolly is to separate the man from the myth, to look past the satin and glitter, beyond the tragedy and the addiction, and focus on the gift he shared with the world. He was a boy from Glasgow who was given up at birth, who found a family, and then found a voice that could captivate millions. For a brilliant, blazing moment in time, he stood at the center of the pop universe, a golden-haired god of glam, his voice the soundtrack to a generation's youth. Though his own story ended in sorrow, the joy, the rebellion, and the sheer unadulterated fun of the music he sang will echo forever. Brian Connolly may have lost his voice, but we will never lose his songs. And in that, there is a kind of immortality. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.